I'm Sienna Bose, and today we are going to start a new series which is on human anatomy. We will start discussing about the basic things about human anatomy, and later on, eventually we will go deeper into this subject. Today we are going to talk about the subdivisions of anatomy. So let's begin. Our first subdivision is cadaveric anatomy. Number 1, cadaveric anatomy. Cadaveric anatomy is the anatomy which deals with dead bodies. Anatomy which deals with dead bodies. This anatomy is also known as macroscopic, or gross anatomy, or gross anatomy. And this can be further divided into two types of cadaveric anatomy, which are regional anatomy, which is anatomy in which we study the cadaver in regions like upper limb, lower limb, head, neck, brain, thorax, and abdomen. Thorax, abdomen, etc. That was about regional anatomy. Another type of cadaveric anatomy is systemic anatomy. This is type 1. Systemic anatomy is the anatomy in which we study the cadaver per systems, like the skeletal system, or osteology, muscular system, or myology, articulatory system, or the joints, articulatory system, or arthrology, then come up respiratory, digestive, urogenital, and endocrine systems. Which are splanchnology, Then the vascular system, or in other words, the circulatory system, or angiology, radiology, etc. These are the different systems in which we can study systemic anatomy. And a short note, the skeletal system osteology, arthrology, and myology come under the locomotor system. Locomotor system includes osteology, myology, and arthrology. Now you may take a look at the board before we move on to the rest of the subdivisions of anatomy. Moving on to the next few subdivisions. Moving on to our next few subdivisions. Living anatomy. Number 2, living anatomy. This kind of anatomy is studied by the processes inspection, palpation, which means feeling, percussion, which is another type of palpation, percussion, then auscultation, auscultation means listening to sounds, sounds of the body like heartbeat, the lungs, or if you're breathing, then we'll listen to your lungs, etc. These kinds of sounds, if we listen, it is called auscultation. By radiography, etc. These are the different methods in which we can study living anatomy. The next subdivision of anatomy is embryology. Number 3, embryology. Embryology. Or developmental anatomy. Developmental anatomy. This is the anatomy concerned with prenatal developments. Prenatal, that means before the baby is born. Prenatal developments in an individual. In an individual. Developmental history. Developmental history is ontogeny, whereas evolutionary history, is phylogeny. Then we have histology. Number 4, histology. Histology is the anatomy which we study using the help of a microscope. It is also called microscopic anatomy. Like we discussed, cadaveric anatomy was macroscopic anatomy. Histology is microscopic anatomy. Microscopic anatomy Anatomy studied with the help of a microscope. Studied with the help of a microscope. Now you may take a look at the board before we move to our next set of subdivisions. Heading towards our next set. Our next set of subdivisions. Surface anatomy. Or topographic anatomy. Topographic anatomy. It is basically the study of the deeper structures with respect to the skin, like, for example, palpation of arteries, which are deep with perspective to the skin. Palpation of arteries. One example of surface anatomy. Surface anatomy comes in handy in surgical and medical practices. Surgical and medical practices. Number 5. Our next subdivision is number 6, radiographic or imaging anatomy. Radiographic or imaging anatomy. Here we study the deeper parts of the body using radiography. Both plane or contrast, Then we have ultrasonography or ultrasound, computerized tomographic scans, computerized tomographic or CT scans, etc. We use these methods to study radiographic or imaging anatomy, in which we take a look at the deeper parts of the body using the following methods which I have mentioned. And after that, we have comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. In comparative anatomy, we study anatomy of other animals, and then we try to find the changes in the human body parts and the animal's anatomy which we are studying. That is a comparison kind of thing. Comparison. And we study other animals' anatomy. Before we go to our next set of subdivisions, you may take a close look at the board. Moving towards our next set of subdivisions in anatomy. Our next few subdivisions: physical, anthropology. Number 8. What is about physical anthropology? This is the external study of the external features, study of the external features and measurement of races and measurement of races, with the study of prehistoric remains in humans. Study of prehistoric remains of humans. That is physical anthropology. Next we have applied anatomy. Applied anatomy is the study of anatomy where we use the anatomical knowledge in surgical and medical practices. We use anatomical knowledge in surgical and medical practices. That is applied anatomy. And then we have experimental anatomy. Mental anatomy. Where we study the factors which affect the structure of the body. Factors which affect structure of the body. And that was experimental anatomy. Lastly, we have genetics. Genetics is basically the study of information stored in the chromosomes. Study of the information stored in chromosomes. And that is about genetics. Now you may take a look at the board. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and please like, share, and subscribe my channel, and stay tuned for more episodes on anatomy. Thank you.